After I fell down due to the sharp pain, my husband and his mistress stepped over me and ran away. Abigail's first big break after college was landing a job at Mason Trading Company as a lawyer's assistant. It was a bustling place, always buzzing with activity and ringing phones that hardly ever stopped. Abigail loved the pace. It kept her on her toes. In those early days, while she was still figuring out which elevator took her where, she ran into Luke. He worked in the purchasing department, just a corridor away from the legal offices. He was arguing over the phone about some shipment that got delayed. He hung up, noticed Abigail watching, and rolled his eyes. "Suppliers," he muttered. "Tough day." "You could say that," Abigail asked, half smiling. "Every day is a battlefield here." "You know it," Luke replied. "Just started this week. I'm Abigail. Luke, welcome to the madness. Don't let the chaos scare you off." They started having lunch together, mostly because it was easy to navigate the huge cafeteria with someone who knew the place. Luke was easy to talk to, had a sharp wit, and wasn't shy about saying exactly what he thought. One lunch turned into many, and soon those lunches turned into after-work drinks. Their conversations ranged from mundane work stuff to more personal topics. Abigail learned that Luke was an only child, adored by his mother, but constantly nagged for not living up to his potential, whatever that meant. "You haven't met my mom yet, but brace yourself when you do," Luke warned one evening as they grabbed beers after a particularly long day. "She has this idea of the perfect woman, and trust me, no one's good enough." It wasn't long before their friendship took a romantic turn. After about a year of dating, Luke proposed. The wedding was simple but perfect for them. They bought an apartment together with savings Abigail had from her grandmother and a savings account she built up. It felt like everything was falling into place. Life with Luke was mostly smooth, except for the occasional bickering about who forgot to buy milk or whose turn it was to clean the apartment. But nothing too heavy, just the usual stuff couples go through. Until one day, everything felt different. Abigail was exhausted all the time, and even the smell of coffee, which she loved, made her nauseous. One morning, struggling to even get out of bed, she decided enough was enough. She booked an appointment with her doctor, thinking maybe she had the flu or something. Sitting in the waiting room, flipping through a magazine without really reading it, her name was finally called. Dr. Melissa was always straight to the point. After a few questions and tests, she dropped the news. "Well, Abigail, congratulations are in order. You're pregnant." "Pregnant?" Abigail repeated the word, feeling it foreign and heavy. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure," Dr. Melissa smiled, handing her the test result. "But you need to be careful. Your body is signaling a few warning signs. Nothing too scary, but you need rest and less stress." Abigail nodded, her mind racing. Pregnant? How would Luke react? She couldn't tell over the phone. This needed a face-to-face. Walking through the door of their apartment that evening, Abigail found Luke on the couch, eyes glued to his phone. "Luke, we need to talk," Abigail said, her voice shaky. "I went to the doctor today. We're going to have a baby." Luke's face changed. It wasn't the reaction she'd hoped for. "A baby, Abigail? It's not great timing, you know. We haven't even traveled like we talked about, and a baby, that's a huge change." Abigail felt a pain in her heart. "I know it's unexpected, but it's also kind of amazing, right? We're going to be parents." Luke ran his hands through his hair, a sign he was stressed. "I don't know, Abigail. It's too much. It's too soon." "Too soon for a family with me?" Abigail asked, hurt coloring her tone. "No, that's not what I mean. I just thought we have more time, just us two." The conversation went in circles. Luke saying it was bad timing, Abigail trying to highlight the positive. By the end of it, Luke had closed off, and Abigail was left feeling alone, holding onto a piece of news that should have brought them together but instead was pushing them apart. The next day, Abigail spoke to her boss, Mr. Bennett. She needed some accommodation given the doctor's orders. "Mr. Bennett, I need to ask for a change. I'm pregnant, and there are some complications. Could I possibly work from home?" Mr. Bennett, who was always more understanding than Abigail gave him credit for, didn't hesitate. "Of course, Abigail. We'll set up everything you need at home. Take care of yourself and the little one." Going home that day, Abigail hoped Luke had softened a bit, but when she told him about the remote work arrangement, his reaction was cold. "So, you're just going to be home now? What about all the plans we had? I thought you'd be happy I found a solution to keep the stress down." "Abigail, it's like you're not even listening," Luke snapped back. It's too soon for all this. Abigail went to bed early that night, feeling the distance between them grow. As she lay there, the reality of her situation sinking in, she realized this journey was going to be tougher than she thought. The air in their apartment felt heavier these days, like each day was a cloudy one even if the sun was shining outside. Luke's affection seemed to drain away as quickly as it came. He grew more distant, more irritated by the small ways Abigail's life had to change because of the pregnancy. He said he felt neglected, like he was second to Abigail's health and the baby's needs. His mom, Mrs. Foster, was no help either. She called one afternoon, her voice as cold as the winter wind. Abigail, this child, it's not the right time. You should be focusing on supporting Luke, not dragging him into fatherhood. Abigail clenched the phone tighter, fighting the sting in her eyes. It's not like I planned this by myself, Mrs. Foster. It's our child, not just mine. There are options, you know. You're just choosing the most selfish one. Her words sliced through Abigail, leaving her feeling hollow inside. As if that wasn't enough, Luke's behavior started changing even more. His cologne was masked by another scent, a woman's perfume, unfamiliar and sweet, clinging to his clothes. The first time Abigail smelled it, she convinced herself it was a mix-up at the dry cleaner. But then it happened again and again. He also started staying out late, mumbling about needing to catch up on work, and his weekends were booked up with sudden business trips. It was too much to chalk up to coincidence. Abigail held her tongue, not wanting to believe the worst, but the seed of doubt was planted. She couldn't ignore it anymore. That Saturday, when Luke mentioned another business trip, Abigail reached out to Christopher, an old classmate who now worked as a detective. They met at a small cafe, the kind where you could talk without every table overhearing your conversation. Christopher slid a folder across the table to Abigail. I got what you asked for, Abigail. You sure you want to see this? Abigail nodded, not trusting her voice, and opened the folder. The photos were clear, unmistakable. There was Luke, and with him, a woman Abigail recognized from his office, a new hire that he'd mentioned in passing. Abigail, I'm sorry, Christopher said, his voice low. There's video too. It's consistent. Abigail's heart sank to the pit of her sluicage. Thanks, Christopher. I needed to know. Abigail went home numb, carrying the folder like it was made of lead. As she turned the key in the lock, the door swung open. Mrs. Foster stood there, her face twisted in disapproval. I came to see how you are, she said. Luke said he's worried about you, all alone here. Her eyes darted around suspiciously. I know about Luke. He's not on a business trip. He's with someone else, Abigail said. Mrs. Foster scoffed, her defense quick and sharp. You're driving him away. Always sick, complaining, needing things. What man wants that? That's no excuse for cheating. And do you think having his baby will fix things? Abigail shot back, anger rising. Do you think he's cheating because he doesn't want a child? No one in the family wants this child, Abigail, only you. You're just choosing the most selfish one. Her words were like a physical blow. Get out, Abigail said, her voice trembling now. Mrs. Foster threw her hands up and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence after was deafening. Abigail sat on the couch, feeling numb and hollow. 30 minutes felt like an eternity as each second passed with heavy, painful ticks echoing the throbbing in her heart. Her mind was racing, but a dreadful resolve settled over her. She had to face Luke and see the truth with her own eyes. Christopher had given her all the details she needed. The Grand View Hotel, room 718, he'd said, his voice filled with reluctant professionalism. Abigail's hands were shaking slightly as she parked the car and walked into the hotel lobby. Her sluicage was in knots. She took the elevator, her heart pounding in her ears with each floor it passed. When the doors opened, she stepped out into a brightly lit hallway that felt too cheery for what she was about to do. Room 718 was just down the hall, and as she approached, she could hear laughter and the clinking of glasses. Her hand trembled as she knocked on the door. Room service must be here with the champagne. She heard a woman's voice, chirpy and carefree. After a few seconds that felt like hours, the door swung open. Luke looked out, his expression changing from anticipation to shock in an instant. Abigail? What? How did you find? I know everything, Luke, Abigail said, her voice stronger than she felt. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past him into the room. The sight that greeted her was like a slap. There she was, his mistress, half-dressed, scrambling to cover up as if modesty meant anything now. Luke recovered from his initial shock, and his face hardened. "Why are you here, Abigail? To spy on me? To beg?" "Beg?" Abigail echoed, incredulous, feeling a bitter laugh rise in her throat. "I came for the truth, not that you'd know anything about that." He scoffed, stepping closer. "You want the truth? Here it is. I'm not happy with you anymore. You're always so wrapped up in yourself, and this baby." His mistress, now somewhat dressed, smirked and added, "Maybe if you paid more attention to him, he wouldn't be with me." Her words stung, but it was his agreement, the nod he gave her, that twisted the knife deeper. "Yeah, you should be thanking us. We're just waiting for your baby to be born, then I can finally move on properly." The room spun around Abigail, and a sharp pain stabbed through her abdomen. She doubled over, gasping, the shock and pain mingling into a nauseating swirl. "Luke, I think something's wrong," Abigail managed to say, her voice a whisper of desperation. "Please call an ambulance." He and his mistress exchanged a look, a quick, dismissive glance, and then he turned back to Abigail. "You're probably just overreacting, like always." They dressed quickly, stepping over Abigail as if she were just another obstacle in their path. The last thing Abigail saw before darkness claimed her was the closing door, the click of it shutting, echoing ominously in the cold, empty room. Abigail woke up to the gentle yet urgent voice of a maid trying to rouse her. Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her face swam into view as Abigail blinked away, the darkness clouding her vision. The pain was still there, a dull ache that seemed to echo through her entire body. "Where am I?" Her voice sounded hoarse, foreign even to her own ears. "You're still in the hotel room, dear. I found you on the floor. I'm calling an ambulance." True to her word, the next thing Abigail knew, she was being wheeled through the emergency room. The hospital lights were harsh, blinding, as nurses and doctors swarmed around her, their voices a cacophony of concern that she could barely comprehend. They asked questions, too many questions, but all Abigail could think about was the betrayal and the pain. Luke never showed up at the hospital. Neither did his mother. Calls went unanswered. Their silence was more painful than any physical wound. By the time the doctor came with the news that Abigail had lost the baby, the grief was so heavy, so overwhelming, it was all she could do not to scream. The loss was not just a personal tragedy. It felt like an injustice, one that Luke, his mistress, and his mother had a hand in. They had abandoned her, left her alone at her most vulnerable. The bitterness and anger stood inside her, brewing a storm. After what felt like an eternity, the hospital discharged Abigail. She drove straight to their apartment and began packing Luke's things. Each shirt she folded, each sock she threw into the box, was a severance, a cutting of ties. With his belongings piled in the trunk of her car, she drove to Mrs. Foster's house. She didn't bother with niceties. She unloaded his things right in the driveway, letting them fall wherever they may. She didn't knock. She just walked in. Mrs. Foster was sitting in the living room, a look of resignation on her face. She knew why Abigail was there. "Abigail," she started, her tone weary. "You should just leave. Take what dignity you have left." "Dignity?" Abigail laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think I came here for a lecture on dignity from you? He's my son. I stand by him, and he will be better off without you," Mrs. Foster said bluntly. "He has excellent lawyers. You'll only embarrass yourself." Something snapped inside Abigail. "Do you even care that your grandchild is gone? That your son left me alone in a hotel room to lose his child?" Her eyes flickered away, unable to meet Abigail's. "It's a tough situation. It's done, Abigail." Abigail stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "How did you feel as a mother, knowing what happened? Knowing your grandchild was lost?" Mrs. Foster didn't answer. She just looked away, a crack in her composed facade. "I will see your son in court," Abigail said, the words heavy with promise. "You can tell him that." Turning on her heel, Abigail left her sitting there alone with the weight of her choices. As Abigail walked back to her car, the cool air felt sharp against her skin, but her path had never been clearer. She would fight, not just for herself, but for the life that was lost and for the truth that needed to see the light of day. Stepping into the courthouse, Abigail felt every eye on her, or maybe it was just the weight of what was about to happen pressing down. Her best friend from college, Savannah, was right beside her. She'd become a shark in the courtroom, known for tearing apart even the slickest defense. When Abigail told her about everything, she didn't hesitate. "I've got this, Abigail, And don't worry about the fees. This one's on me, Savannah had said, her voice fierce and reassuring. They sat at their table, papers neatly arranged, evidence at the ready. Across from them, Luke and his mistress looked confident, a smugness that irked Abigail. As the proceedings began, their lawyer painted a picture of Abigail as unstable, broken by grief into fabricating stories. The plaintiff has suffered immense emotional distress, yes, which has led to these wild accusations. There is no substantial evidence of any affair or wrongdoing on my client's part. When it was their turn, Savannah stood, her presence commanding the room. Your Honor, not only do we have substantial evidence, but we also have a testimony that will corroborate everything my client has claimed, Savannah said. She presented the photos first, clear and undeniable proof of the affair, passed around for the judge and eventually to the opposing counsel, who looked visibly shaken as they viewed them. Next, Savannah played the video from the hotel. The room fell silent as the scene played out. Abigail entering the hotel, then Luke and his mistress laughing, hugging, leaving the hotel without a hint of concern. But that's not all, Savannah continued. She called the maid who found Abigail to the stand. Her testimony was simple but powerful. I found her on the floor, unconscious. They were gone. She could have died. Luke's face had gone white, and his mistress couldn't sit still, her leg bouncing nervously. When they were given a chance to respond, Luke stood up, his voice shaky. This isn't how it looks. We were just scared and confused. Scared? So you leave your pregnant wife unconscious on the floor. Savannah shot back, her tone icy. The judge took everything into consideration, the weight of the evidence, the testimonies. After what felt like a lifetime, he spoke. I find in favor of the plaintiff, Abigail Foster. The evidence of infidelity and negligence is overwhelming. I am granting a 50-50th division of all marital assets, as well as financial compensation for the emotional distress caused by the actions of the defendants. As they walked out of the courtroom, Savannah elbowed Abigail gently, a victorious glint in her eye. How's that for justice? Abigail managed a small smile, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. Thanks, Savannah. I couldn't have done this without you. Life had been limping back to normal after the courtroom drama. Abigail bought a small apartment, and every new piece of furniture, every picture hung, was a step away from her past torment. The only shadow that loomed over her fresh start was seeing Luke and his mistress together at work, a constant reminder of the betrayal. One afternoon, as Abigail was sorting through some legal briefs, her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't seen in a while. It was Luke's mother, Mrs. Foster. Abigail, could we meet? I need to talk to you. Her voice trembled over the phone. Abigail hesitated, memories of their last encounter flashing through her mind. Why should I meet you, Mrs. Foster? It's about Luke and your company. Please, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Curiosity piqued, and a bit of old loyalty to the company that stood by her, Abigail agreed. They met at a small cafe, away from prying eyes. Mrs. Foster looked worn, her eyes rimmed with red as if she had been crying. Luke, he's not the boy I raised anymore, she started, not meeting Abigail's eyes. He and that woman, they're planning to cheat the company, sell off assets, and they want to force me out of my home. Her words hung heavy between them. Abigail was still processing when Mrs. Foster grabbed her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Please, you're the only one I can trust to stop this. The plea in her eyes was real, but so was Abigail's reluctance. Mrs. Foster, your family drama is not my business anymore. It's not just family, Abigail. It's your company, too. They're planning something big. It could ruin everything. Her urgency struck a chord. Abigail was, after all, part of that company. It had given her a chance when she was just a college grad, and many of her colleagues were like family. All right, Abigail conceded, more for the company than for her. Back at work, Abigail started digging. She quietly pulled records and contracts, tracing the trail of transactions Luke and his mistress were involved in. It didn't take long to spot irregularities. The numbers didn't add up. Goods were being purchased at inflated prices, far above market value. Armed with evidence, Abigail made her way to the director's office, laying the documents on his desk. She watched his eyes narrow as he scanned the evidence. This is serious, Mr. Bennett stated flatly, looking up at Abigail. I'll handle this from here. Thank you, Abigail. You may have just saved this company from a significant loss. Leaving his office, Abigail felt a mix of relief and anticipation. Walking past Luke and his mistress, she caught snippets of their mocking laughter. She couldn't help but smile to herself. Justice had a way of finding its path, no matter how twisted the road might be. After exposing Luke and his mistress, a full-scale investigation rippled through the company. As it unfolded, Abigail was often called to testify, detailing every discrepancy and irregular transaction she had uncovered. The courtroom once again became a familiar setting, but this time, Abigail stood confidently, bolstered by the truth and the mountains of evidence that supported their claims. The legal battles were intense and draining. Luke and his mistress faced the consequences head-on. The company, having suffered significant potential losses, pursued justice relentlessly, culminating in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the duo. The verdict was as expected: guilty. The court's decision barred them from holding any senior positions in the future, a fitting end to their corporate malfeasance. Amidst the chaos, Abigail's own career took a surprising but welcome turn. The company recognized her efforts and promoted her to a senior lawyer, an acknowledgement that came with a significant award. One quiet afternoon, as Abigail was organizing files in her new office, a spacious room with a view of the city skyline, her phone rang. The screen displayed a number she hadn't seen in a long while. It was Mrs. Foster. "Abigail, it's me." Her voice came through, tinged with humility, a stark contrast to their last encounters. I wanted to thank you for saving my home from being sold out from under me." Her gratitude was genuine, and despite everything, Abigail felt a twinge of sympathy for her. "You're welcome. I did what I felt was right." There was a pause, a breath of silence, before Mrs. Foster added, "I was wrong about you, Abigail, so very wrong. I used to think you didn't deserve my son, but I've come to realize it was he who didn't deserve you." Her words, unexpected and raw, took Abigail by surprise. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you might know. Could we meet? I'd like to apologize properly, face to face," she suggested, a hint of hope in her tone. Abigail considered her request. "All right, Mrs. Foster, let's meet." They decided on a quiet cafe, neutral ground for what was to be a frank conversation. Sitting across from her, Abigail saw the changes the months had wrought on her. Gone was the haughty demeanor, replaced by a somber reflectiveness. "Abigail, I'm sorry for everything. I was blinded by my own expectations, my own desires for Luke, that I couldn't see the truth. You were always the stronger person, and I admire that deeply now," she confessed, her eyes not meeting Abigail's. "It's been a tough journey for us all," Abigail acknowledged, her voice steady. "But your apology is accepted, Mrs. Foster." They talked more about life, about lessons learned. It was clear that friendship wasn't on the table, but mutual respect hung in the balance, a fine thread that connected their shared history. Leaving the cafe, Abigail felt as if her words had lifted some of the shadows of the past. She walked back to her office, past the now empty desks of Luke and his mistress, a reminder of the bullet dodged. Their laughter no longer echoed through the halls. Instead, her own steps sounded a steady beat towards the future. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe for more awesome stories like this. Stay blessed and healthy. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.